three seat heights here. One is too high, one is too low, and the other one is bang on. Which one is right, and how do you nail your own seat height with a simple approach? Stick around for the answer in this video and a whole lot more as we get into the 18th edition of the RCA Training Tip Show. So we're back with bike fitting expert Neil Stanbury, who's been fitting road cyclists for 10 years in conjunction with being a sports physiotherapist. A few quick things before we get into this piece. Neil says at the end of this video,
it doesn't show up on footage very well, which is a real pain.
So despite the fact that I've shot some of this footage at 100 frames per second and slowed it right down, it's still quite hard to pinpoint or see some of the things that Neil is describing. Secondly, Neil provides a fair amount of context up front about the seat either being too high or too low before providing a simple approach about how you can go about nailing your own seat height. And lastly, don't forget, I've got a free ebook for road cyclists looking to take their performance to the next level, which I'll link to below. So let's get into it.
Really tricky question, and setting seat height is not an easy. It's not as easy as it should be. If the person's got really good body awareness, they will be able to tell when their seat height is really good versus fractionally too high. But if you happen to have it set far outside of the normal parameters, let's say that it's 30 millimeters too high. If you move it up and down a little bit, it'll still feel just as rubbish, and you won't be able to tell when it's correct because you're still so far outside the range. So first you've got to get the range roughly right.
What do you typically see? People have it too high or too low? Blend.
If they've been fitted professionally before, and it's off, it'll be too high most of the time. It's very rare that you come in and go, and they've had 3 bike fits and the seat's way too low. That's very rare. Some of the better known motion tracking software recommendations of knee angles, which is one of the, they say, your knee angle at the bottom of the stroke should be between 27 and 33 degrees or something. Those seat heights tend to, when they come in to see me, they tend to almost universally be somewhere between 10 and 20 millimeters too high for that rider. Wow. So yeah, we won't mention names or companies, but those, if they're wrong, if they've come from that motion tracking software angle recommendation, it's usually too high by a reasonable margin. So this is how I do it. I'll explain some of the rationale behind how this works. You've got to understand a little bit of the basics of the leg as it's moving through the stroke. So as if you imagine this is a representation of the person's knee, you've got the femur and their tibia here and the foot down the bottom. What I look for is a smooth, controlled extension moment at the bottom of the stroke. So as the leg starts to straighten out at the bottom of the stroke, as it reaches its maximal straightness, whatever angle that may be, if the person has got full control of that movement, then their seat height is either too low or just right. When they start to get a situation where this happens, and at the back of the knee, you start to see a rate of change of leg extension which starts to increase. So it comes down, it's extending at some normal control method, and then it flickers. When you start to see that flicker, that means that the seat is too high for that particular person who's got that particular cleat position and that Q factor or that saddle and all the other parameters. Let's assume that everything else is perfect, and you put the person's seat too high and you put them under a solid load. You have to test this under load. I tell my riders to ride at a sort of a threshold load, something around what they could maintain for 20 minutes or so. Yep. And you look for that control of the leg extension. So what's effectively happening here is if the knee gets too straight for that particular person, the quadricep, which acts over the front of the leg to extend the knee, starts to overpower the hamstring at the bottom of the stroke. And you basically end up with a power differential, which makes you lose control of the leg extension.
And loss of power.
Not as much as you think.
Okay.
Not as much as you think. You might read studies saying that, the seats going up and down doesn't affect outright VO2 max that much and this sort of thing. I think some of them say that if the seat's far too high, it certainly does. But if it's too low, it doesn't seem to affect VO2 max and power output that much. But what it will do is affect other things, like the person will start to compensate around the seat being too high. They'll start dropping one hip down to protect their dominant leg or something like that. So they're more likely to get injured. Yeah. If the seat's too high, you'll tend to burn up in your quads a lot. This is another way that you can possibly set it yourself at home. If you're doing some hard efforts, some sort of 3 or 5 minute efforts, and your quads are burning up and you feel no fatigue in your hamstrings, it often means the seat is too high. It can also mean that it's too far back or too forward, but let's forget about that for the subject of simplicity. It often means the seat is too high. You should, at the end of a really hard lot of intervals, feel pretty even fatigue between your quad, your hamstring, and hopefully your glutes, which means that you're spreading the load of power generation over the largest possible surface area of muscles. That's the ideal, kind of scenario. So you look for that control of the leg extension. And the reason that this unlocking occurs at the back of the knee when the seat is too high, if you look at a knee from the side, the hamstring tendons where they cross across the back of the knee, if this is the pivot point of your knee, the hamstring tendon, when the leg is straight, the hamstring tendons pass very close to the pivot point of the knee. The quadriceps tendon, the patella tendon, has got a patella in the middle of it, which acts as a lever arm to basically increase the leverage of the quadricep muscle group. So when the leg is straight, the quadriceps have much greater relative power than the hamstrings. So you can think of this as if you're trying to do like a seated leg extension, even when your leg is nearly fully straight, you've still got a lot of power in your quad. But if you try and do a hamstring curl in isolation with your leg straight, it's as weak as a kitten. If you bend your knee 90 degrees, however, the hamstring starts to become more powerful because essentially the pivot point as the knee rolls back, the hamstring pivot point is getting further away. So the lever arms become more equal when the leg bends. So as the leg becomes too straight, the quadriceps starts to generate too much power for the hamstring to control at the bottom of the stroke. And so you need to have a fairly smooth transition as the leg starts to extend to when it starts to bend again. You need to have a smooth transition of this movement. And if it's not smooth, if it starts losing control because your leg is getting too straight, you will compensate. And everything, this all comes back to compensation strategies. As soon as you lose control of the motion, the dominant hemisphere of your brain will start to protect your dominant leg. So if you have a person who is perfectly skeletally symmetrical and you put their seat too high, almost nobody sits too high and evenly overextends both legs. It just almost never happens. I've seen it once or twice ever. You put them too high and their brain goes, this is no good. If I keep doing this, I'm going to injure myself, right? So that what they will do is they will drop their dominant leg down and forward. In your case, it's your right leg. 80, 90% of us, we drop our right hip when there's a positional problem like this. And our brain does that to shorten up the reach to the cranks on the right-hand side. So you look at the person from the right and their right leg looks happy. It's got full control of the bottom of the stroke. And the left leg, because the hip is up and back and away from the crank, it's overextending. So the person will essentially display more asymmetry if the seat is too high. So if they don't have control, they will compensate. And really that's the biggest kind of problem, is not so much that it's slightly too low, so you've lost 1 watt or 5 watts or something. If it's slightly too high, you will compensate. If it's slightly too low, you'll have less problems. But if it's way too low, you'll develop issues. So it's better for it to be too low than too high.
Interesting. Okay.
And the studies show that as well. I think there was a good one on efficiency, VO2 max measurements. And as the seat got too high, the efficiency of the rider went out the window. Partly, I'm guessing, because they were compensating, and partly because their hamstrings weren't contributing to the smooth control of the bottom of the stroke anymore. So they were basically producing almost all of their power on the bottom of that extension bit of the stroke, just with their quad. And so you're putting all the fatigue into one muscle group. Yeah. So that would be my guess as to why that efficiency problem came out in the literature when the seat got too high. Too high, sorry. Yeah. So you're better off being slightly too low than too high.
Okay. So how do you know if you're too low then?
This is a great thing for me to say it, and as a person who's seen 1,000 knees extending 1,000 different ways, I can see it and spot it within about a 1 or 2 millimeter range. When the seat gets too high by 1 or 2 millimeters, I can tell, and I'll lower that person's seat down 2 millimeters, say, and they'll go back up to that 20-minute effort, and they'll go, wow, that feels remarkably more stable and smooth, and it feels like I'm pedaling circles. But if I raise the seat 2 mils, I feel much worse. So when you're at that tipping point, when you're right on the button, the rider can sense it. But if they're way outside that, they won't know what's going on. So you've got to get it pretty close to start with yourself. All of the kind of mathematical rules tend to be fairly useless for a large proportion of people. I'm sure they work for some people. So what I would tend to do is stick your heel on the pedal, like the most basic of the basic ways, right? Sit on the seat, stick your heel on the pedal, have your legs straight. Then lower the seat about 15 millimeters from there, a large amount, right? And then sit yourself on a trainer and do some efforts at about that 20-minute intensity. And every 3 minutes, raise the seat 3 millimeters. So this will take you 20 minutes to do, right? So you ride for 3 minutes, raise it 3 mil. Ride for 3 minutes, raise it 3 mil, and creep it up. And if you've got decent body awareness of what your legs are doing, at some point in that range, it'll probably get to a point where you go, oh, that feels a bit funny now. It doesn't feel like I'm controlling the bottom of the stroke fluently. It feels like my knees, one or both, are starting to chop a little bit at the bottom of the stroke. And invariably you'll feel it in one of your knees before the other, because you've either got one leg that's 2 mils longer than the other, or you start favouring your dominant leg slightly. So as soon as you start to perceive asymmetry creeping in, and you start to perceive a little bit of choppiness of the stroke at the bottom on either leg, you want to go back down 2 mils or 3 mils and ride it at roughly that height. And it, if you're a big heel dropper, you might need to start 30 mils lower. If you're a severe toe pointer, you might actually need to go up from having your heel on the pedal, right? So there's a lot of variables in there, but I would, if you were trying to do it really roughly yourself at home, sit yourself on a trainer, stick your heel on the pedal with your leg locked, drop the seat 15, maybe even 20 millimeters from there. You're not going to injure yourself riding for 20 minutes or for 3 minutes with the seat a little bit too low. And do it at about a 20-minute intensity. So a decent clip, but not like a VO2 max super hard effort.
Yes.
And as soon as you start to feel choppiness creeping in at the bottom of the stroke on either leg, that's probably pretty close to your seat height. Yeah. As soon as it gets too high, the rider will start to compensate. And if they've got decent body awareness, they will feel that.
Yes.
Yeah. They'll go from feeling quite nice to, something's a bit off here. And that's usually a sign that they're just a little bit too high. The biggest effect that they usually notice is less weight on their hands.
Okay.
So when the seat's too high, because of that effect of the quad effectively overpowering the hamstring at the bottom of the stroke, the quad attaches up on the front of your pelvis, so it literally pulls you down onto your hands. If your hamstrings are working nice and strongly through the bottom of the stroke, you will have less weight on your hands because they attach up on the back of the pelvis and they will literally lift weight off your hands. Yeah. So it's another thing you can kind of look for is balance. Once you, I feel lighter on the hands at this particular seat height, that's probably the right seat height. It's probably pretty close. There's that, and then there's efficiency. So they'll be doing hard efforts and they'll notice that their quads are no longer doing all of the work. They're not getting massive lactate burn in their quads. They're getting it everywhere. Quad, hamstring, glute, and to a lesser extent calf, and that's a good way. I call that idea preferential fatigue. If you're not preferentially fatiguing one muscle group, it usually means your seat height and your setback and all of the other things are pretty damn close. It's one of the things we really seek to find in a good position is the person gets off the bike and they're tired, but their legs aren't jelly. You've ever had a situation where you get off after a hard ride and you can't walk up a set of stairs because your quads are just burned?
Yes.
It means something's off and you're doing so much work with your quads that they're copping all the load. Your legs should be tired, but you should still be able to walk and squat down and do that sort of stuff if your position is really good. Yeah, effectively, yeah. Whether it translates into a bigger 20-minute wattage output or whether it translates into an effect like, I did a 4-hour ride that I did 6 weeks ago and I was in much better shape at the end of it. So like general energy conservation over a really long time of riding versus an outright power gain. Because power output, cardiovascular power output on a bike is primarily limited by cardiac output and lung oxygen transference and mitochondrial density and all these things. It's not so much limited hugely by the seat being 3 mils too high. But you will cook yourself less on a long, hard ride if your position is really good. So you get to the end of the ride in better shape.